The evening of April 13th, 2026, changed the balance of power in the Middle East forever. 3 American aircraft carrier groups and 10 destroyers had just moved into the Strait of Hormuz. The most powerful navy on the planet was ready for anything. 1/5 of the world's oil flows through this narrow stretch of water every single day. Nothing was supposed to move without their permission. Nothing. But at exactly 3:20 p.m., a small Chinese tanker quietly lifted its anchor near the coast of the UAE. It's already sitting on the American sanctions list. It's flying a fake flag from a country that doesn't even have a sea. What this one ship does in the next 6 hours leaves the entire U.S. Navy silent. No warning shot, no helicopter, no radio call, just watching. This is the real story. The news isn't telling you. Most people watching this war right now think it's a fight of missiles and airstrikes and aircraft carriers. That's not the real story at all. The real story is being fought by one ship you've probably never heard of. By the end of this video, you'll never look at this war the same way again. The date was April 14th, 2026. The place was the Strait of Hormuz. It's the small stretch of sea sitting between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other side. Almost 20% of all the oil sold in the world passes through this one waterway every single day. That one fact alone tells you why this place matters so much. Whoever controls this strait controls the price of fuel in your country and in every country on Earth. This is what was really at stake. On April 13th, 2026, at 3 p.m. UTC, the United States Central Command officially started a total naval blockade of every single Iranian port. It came right after peace talks between the United States and Iran fell apart in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. President Donald Trump ordered this blockade to force Iran to finally surrender in the war that had been going on since February 28th, 2026. The ship at the center of this whole story is called the MV Rich Starry. It's 616 feet long. It's owned by a company based in Shanghai, China, called Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping Company Limited. This company was put on the United States sanctions list back in 2023 for moving Iranian oil around the world. On the day the blockade began, the Rich Starry was carrying 250,000 barrels of methanol. Every single number and name and date you're about to hear comes from real shipping data from Lloyd's List Reuters, KPLR, Marine Traffic, Tanker Trackers, Al Jazeera, Newsweek, the BBC, and the United States Central Command itself. This is the truth backed by hard data. Before we get to the crossing itself, you first need to understand how the world reached this very dangerous moment. The story starts on February 28th, when the United States launched a massive military operation against Iranian targets known as Operation Epic Fury. Israeli forces joined the same campaign and hit several Iranian cities and nuclear sites at the same time. The fighting was heavy. Iran had to answer somehow. Iran didn't have the planes or the missiles to match America. Tehran did the one thing it could do. It started to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian forces began attacking and warning every commercial ship that tried to move through the waterway without Iranian permission. The impact was huge. Before the war started, around 138 ships passed through the strait every single day. Within just a few weeks, that number fell almost to zero. Global oil markets started to panic. Prices jumped. Fuel costs went up around the world. On March 15th, President Donald Trump publicly asked both NATO and China to help the United States reopen the strait. China openly refused. NATO wasn't willing to send warships either. Trump was on his own. Which is why on March 19th, the United States military began a direct campaign of airstrikes to force the waterway open again. Through late March, Trump repeatedly warned that he'd destroy all Iranian infrastructure if Iran didn't allow free shipping to return. The pressure worked for a short time. On April 8th, a temporary ceasefire was agreed between the two sides. One of the main conditions of this ceasefire was that Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz to normal global shipping. Iran didn't do that. Iran did the exact opposite. Tehran began controlling every single ship that entered the strait. They started charging a fee of more than $1 million for each ship that wanted to pass. They accepted these fees only in cryptocurrency to avoid the international banking system. This wasn't a reopening. This was Iran turning the most important waterway in the world into a paved road under its own control. Washington wasn't ready to accept that. The United States called a new round of peace talks in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. On the weekend of April 11th and April 12th, the American vice president flew in person and met directly with top Iranian officials. The talks lasted a long day. They ended with nothing. No deal was signed. Both sides left angry. On Sunday, April 13th, Trump made his move. He announced that the United States Navy itself would now blockade every single Iranian port, starting the very next day. 3 aircraft carrier groups and 10 destroyers immediately moved into position around the strait. U.S. Central Command then issued one clear written statement. It said the blockade would be enforced against all ships entering or leaving any Iranian port. It also said the United States wouldn't block ships that were traveling between non-Iranian ports. Remember that one line. That's the exact line that would let a Chinese tanker move past the entire U.S. Navy within hours. You might be wondering why a country as powerful as the United States couldn't stop one ship. The answer starts with understanding what kind of ship the rich Starry really is. This isn't an ordinary oil tanker at all. The details matter. Its international maritime number is 9773301. It's a permanent number that can't be changed or faked by any ship owner anywhere in the world. The ship is a combined chemical and crude oil carrier with a dead weight of 36,031 tons. It measures 616 feet from end to end, which makes it a medium-sized tanker by modern shipping standards. What makes this ship strange is the flag. On paper, the rich Starry is registered under the flag of Malawi. Malawi is a small country in southern Africa that has no coastline and no sea of its own. Why would a big oil tanker register under a country that has no sea? The answer is simple. Registering a large oil tanker under the flag of a landlocked country is one of the oldest methods used by ships that want to hide their real identity and their real owners. In the shipping world, this is called a flag of convenience. The true owner of the rich Starry is a Chinese company called Shanghai Xuanrun Shipping Company Limited. The entire crew on board is Chinese. When the ship began its voyage on April 13th, it was openly broadcasting the words China owners and crew inside its official shipping information. In 2023, the United States Treasury Department put both the ship and its owner on the Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctions list for one very simple reason. The rich Starry had a long and well-recorded history of moving Iranian oil around U.S. sanctions for many years. The shipping intelligence company Tanker Trackers publicly described this ship as a repeat automatic identification system, FAKER, and a known sanctions breaker with a history of carrying Iranian refined products. The automatic identification system is the tracking signal that every large commercial ship in the world has to broadcast at all times. It tells port authorities and other ships exactly where it's located and where it's going. What makes the rich Starry different from every other tanker is the level of planning behind it. The ship had been sending fake position signals for 11 days in a row before the blockade even began. From April 3rd to April 14th, it had been quietly loading Iranian cargo while pretending to be somewhere else. This wasn't luck. This was a plan. Its officially declared cargo on April 13th was 250,000 barrels of methanol, which is around 31,500 tons. The stated loading port was Hamria in the United Arab Emirates. Shipping analysts from K. Peeler and Lloyd's List strongly believe the real origin of the cargo was Iran itself. The rich Starry belongs to what the shipping world calls the Shadow Fleet, or the Dark Fleet. It's a large network of older tankers that change their names, their flags, and their owners again and again to move sanctioned oil without being caught. The rich Starry is one of the most experienced ships inside this whole network. This is exactly why it was chosen for this one historic mission. What happened during those 6 hours is something the news never properly told you. At exactly 3:20 p.m. on Monday, April 13th, only 20 minutes after the U.S. blockade became active, the rich Starry lifted its anchor near Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. Its officially stated destination was the deep water port of Sohar in Oman. This route alone should have kept the ship safe from the blockade. Neither of these two ports is Iranian. Both are on the friendly side of the Gulf. things took a sharp turn. The path the rich Starry really took wasn't the normal international shipping route used by most commercial ships moving through the strait. The tanker moved north into the vetting route, approved by the government of Iran south of Larik Island. Larik Island is a small Iranian island sitting inside the strait. It hosts an Iranian military base that inspects every ship that passes through this route and gives it official clearance to move forward. The moment the rich Starry entered this route, it was sailing inside Iranian territorial waters. Under international law, these are the 12 nautical miles of sea that belong directly to Iran. Any American attempt to stop or board the ship inside this zone would have been treated by Tehran as a direct act of war against Iran itself. This was a risk Washington clearly wasn't ready to take over one tanker. The money part will surprise you the most. Iran runs a fee system inside this same route. The government charges $1 for every barrel of liquid cargo that passes through the strait under its protection. Payment is taken when the ship exits the Gulf of Oman, and it's paid only in cryptocurrency. The rich Starry was carrying 250,000 barrels of methanol. The estimated fee paid to Iran for safe passage was around $250,000. This money went directly into the Iranian war economy at a moment when Iran was under heavy international sanctions. Let that sink in. Iran was making money from the same waterway the U.S. was trying to control. In the early hours of Tuesday, April 14th, the rich Starry crossed the full length of the Strait of Hormuz. It moved into the Gulf of Oman and became the first sanctioned ship to make it out of the Gulf after the blockade officially began. What the U.S. Navy did next will shock you. The U.S. Navy didn't fire a single warning shot. The U.S. Navy didn't send any helicopter to board the ship. The U.S. Navy didn't even officially contact the tanker over open radio channels as it moved through the waterway. Nothing happened. Silence. At around 11 a.m. on Tuesday, the rich Starry made a sudden U-turn in the Gulf of Oman just west of the Iranian port of Jask. By Wednesday morning, the tracking data from marine traffic showed the ship sitting off the coast of Iran's Keshem Island, deep inside Iranian territorial waters again. At the very same time, other ships followed the same route that was used by the rich Starry during those hours. The sanctioned tanker Murlikishan passed through on its way to Iraq. The Panama-flagged Peace Gulf passed through carrying Iranian naphtha toward another port. The BBC Verify investigation team found 4 Iran-linked ships and 3 sanctioned ships that left the strait after the blockade officially started. U.S. Central Command publicly claimed that no ships had passed the blockade, and that 6 ships had been turned around in the first 24 hours. The real shipping data coming out of Lloyd's List KPLer and marine traffic told a very different story. The rich Starry had already done what no one in the world thought was possible. The biggest question every serious viewer is asking right now is simple. How did this happen? How did a sanctioned ship flying a false flag pass right in front of the most powerful navy in the world? The answer is far more interesting than just a military failure. It wasn't one gap. It was 6 different gaps all working together at the same time. The first gap was the language of the blockade itself. The Central Command statement said very clearly that the blockade would only target ships going to or leaving Iranian ports. The rich Starry had declared on paper that it was going from the UAE to Oman. On paper, it wasn't touching Iran at all. The U.S. Navy had limited itself with its own written rules. The second gap was Iranian territorial waters. The vetting route south of Larik Island sits entirely inside the 12 nautical miles that legally belong to Iran. The U.S. Navy couldn't enter these waters to stop a ship without starting a new shooting war with Iran. This was a line Washington couldn't afford to cross over one tanker. The third gap was the fake automatic identification system signals. For 11 straight days, the ship had been sending out false position signals. This made it really hard for American tracking systems to build a clear legal case against the ship and its cargo. The fake signals also made it possible for the ship to argue that the methanol on board didn't even come from Iran. The fourth gap was the Malawi flag itself. A ship registered under the flag of a landlocked country has almost no real protection from its flag state. At the same time, no country in the world is willing to take responsibility for enforcing serious action against it. The ship becomes almost without a country in real terms. Lloyd's List officially described the rich Starry as essentially without a country in its own reporting during this period. The fifth gap is something most people will find shocking. It's the entire Chinese shadow fleet system that's been slowly built over many years. Official Chinese customs records show exactly 0 crude oil imports from Iran since 2022. At the same time, Chinese imports of so-called Malaysian crude oil reached 1.3 million barrels per day in 2025. That's more than double what Malaysia really produces in a year. Let that number sink in for a second. The real oil is Iranian. It's moved from ship to ship in secret off the coast of Malaysia. Then it's given a new Malaysian label before being sent to Chinese ports. The rich Starry is one active part of that huge network. The sixth and final gap was purely political. The US could in theory punish China by placing new secondary sanctions on Chinese banks and by taking Chinese tankers at sea. There was already a clear example for this from Operation Southern Spear back in December 2025. The United States is already stuck in a very serious trade war with China over many other issues. Starting a direct economic fight with Beijing over one tanker during an active war with Iran was a risk the Trump administration wasn't ready to accept. When you put all 6 of these gaps together, you can clearly see what really happened. The US Navy could watch the rich Starry in real time using satellites and drones. They couldn't legally or safely stop it. The ship was fully visible and fully untouchable at the same time. You might be thinking it was just bad luck that a Chinese ship was the first one to break the blockade. That's not what happened at all. China didn't send the rich Starry through the strait by accident on that specific day. China sent it first, and China sent it on purpose. There's one very simple reason for this choice. Around 40% of all the crude oil that China imports every single year passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Let that number sit with you. For the entire Chinese economy, keeping this waterway open isn't a choice at all. It's a matter of national survival for Beijing. When the US formally announced the blockade, the Chinese government publicly called the American action dangerous in its own official statement. Just making a diplomatic complaint through normal channels was never going to be enough to protect Chinese interests. China needed to do much more than protest on paper. It needed to test in the real world whether the American blockade was a real solid wall or just a political warning written on paper in Washington. The clever part of Beijing's plan was the choice of ship. Sending a clean, fully legal Chinese tanker through the strait as the first test would have been very risky for Beijing. If the US had stopped such a ship, China would have lost a valuable new ship and suffered a major embarrassment on the global stage in front of every other country watching. China chose a different option. Sending a sanctioned ship that was already on the US blacklist was the perfect test run. The rich Starry had nothing left to lose. It was already banned from American ports and American banks anyway. If the US Navy had stopped the rich Starry, then China would have learned in one single day that the blockade was serious and total. If the ship passed through, then China would prove to the entire world that the American blockade had real gaps in it that could be used by other countries too. The ship did pass through. This one Ume sent a very clear message to every other shipping company and every other government watching from around the world. The American blockade is highly selective, and it isn't complete at all. On the exact same day, Iran pushed 4 of its own Iranian flag container ships through the strait as part of the same shared response to American naval power. Their names were Kashan, Rayan Daisy, and Golban. Only one day later, on Wednesday, April 15th, another Chinese-owned ship followed the same route used by the rich Starry. It was a liquefied petroleum gas carrier called G. Summer. It passed between Larak Island and Keshem Island, while declaring Iraq as its final destination. The economic pressure on Iran was also very high at this exact moment. The Iranian national currency, the rial, had lost 15% of its total value in just one single month before the blockade even began. Tehran really needed to prove to its own population and to the global oil markets that the strait was still working. Otherwise, its economy was at serious risk of a complete fall within weeks. China needed the Iranian oil. Iran needed the Chinese money. This is why the rich Starry was the first planned move in a careful response to the US Navy. The results were immediate. You could see how quickly one ship changed the direction of the entire war. The crossing changed several very important things almost right away. Global oil markets quickly understood from the live shipping data that the American blockade wasn't going to be fully tight. International oil prices adjusted lower than what they'd have been if the blockade had been complete and total. Traders in London, Singapore, and New York were all watching the exact same tracking data at the exact same time. Something really strange happened next. U.S. Central Command publicly announced that 6 ships had been turned back in the first 24 hours of the blockade. Central Command didn't directly confirm or deny the rich Starry crossing in any official public statement. This silence created a very clear gap between what the U.S. military was telling the public and what the independent shipping data was showing the world in real time. Jacob Larson, the Chief Safety and Security Officer of the BIMCO Shipping Association, told reporters during this period that it's honestly quite difficult to get an accurate picture of what goes on inside the strait right now. Even the shipping industry itself was struggling to see the full truth of events on the water. The live traffic data told the real story on the ground. From Monday evening until 4 in the morning, Eastern Time on Tuesday, a total of 14 different ships passed through the strait. 4 of these ships were already on U.S. sanctions lists at the time of their crossing. Remember, before the war on February 28th, a total of 138 ships passed through the same waterway every single day in normal, peaceful times. While the blockade had reduced traffic to a small portion of that number, it hadn't stopped traffic completely. A small leak had now become a steady movement of sanctioned ships through the most important waterway on Earth. On April 16th, Iran made another major move. Tehran officially stopped all domestic petrochemical exports to keep essential supplies inside the country for its own people. This showed that the Iranian government was preparing for a very long standoff with the U.S. They weren't planning to surrender quickly under the pressure. A new situation took shape in the strait. Maritime experts began calling it the double blockade. On one side, the U.S. Navy was blocking ships going to Iran and leaving Iranian ports. On the other side, Iran was blocking ships that refused to pay its own fees. The world's most important oil waterway was now caught between 2 opposing blockades at the same time. Every ship that wanted to pass had to find a way through both of these walls. On that same day, April 16th, President Donald Trump spoke at an event in Las Vegas, Nevada, in front of a large crowd. He told the audience directly to watch what happens in the next week or so and said, "You could be very impressed." This was a very clear public signal that Washington was now seriously thinking about a major military or economic response against Iran or China or both at the same time. The crossing of the rich Starry became the first real hard proof that the blockade wouldn't quickly force Iran to surrender or come back to the negotiation table. It also placed a very difficult political choice in front of the U.S. government. Washington would now either have to place heavy new secondary sanctions on Chinese banks and shipping companies to push China out of the shadow fleet. Otherwise, it would have to quietly accept that its own blockade had a permanent hole in it that couldn't be closed by military force alone. What does all this really mean for the United States Navy in 2026? The whole story of the rich Starry shows a very difficult truth that the major news networks aren't fully telling you. It's a truth that'll shape the entire next 10 years of American military power around the world. The most powerful Navy ever built in human history couldn't stop one sanctioned oil tanker that was only 616 feet in total length. Let that sit with you for a second. The reason for this failure wasn't a lack of ships in the region. It wasn't a lack of weapons or modern technology on those ships at all. The real reason was something much deeper. Really stopping the rich Starry would have meant starting a second shooting war with Iran and a direct economic war with China at the same moment. No American president could accept that kind of risk over one tanker. There's another problem this event exposed to everyone watching. The surveillance and tracking power of the U.S. Navy is amazing. The Navy can track the rich Starry in real time using its International Maritime number 9773301. This number is visible on every public tracking website in the world right now. Anyone with an internet connection can watch the ship move across the ocean. But seeing a ship and legally stopping that ship are two very different things in international law and in real-world military operations. This is the hard truth nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Look at what happened after the crossing. Every single ship that passed through the strait after the rich Starry used the exact same method used by this one Chinese tanker on April 14th. The G Summer used the Iranian vetting route, the Murli-Kishan used it, the Peace Gulf used it, the 4 Iranian flag container ships all used it. A clear working example for breaking the blockade had been created in under 48 hours. Other shipping companies were already studying this example carefully for their own future crossings. There's another part of this story most people miss. Iran was really earning hard money from every crossing through its route. $1 for every barrel of liquid cargo, paid directly in cryptocurrency, was helping the Iranian government continue to fund its entire war economy while operating under heavy international sanctions. The blockade wasn't cutting off Iran from cash. It was instead giving Iran a brand new source of income at the worst possible moment for Washington. This is the painful reality. What's the real lesson from this whole event? The lesson is very clear for every navy in the world watching. Modern naval blockades in the year 2026 aren't beaten by enemy warships at all. They're beaten by automatic identification system, faking, and flags of convenience and shadow fleet networks and careful political calculation by countries that know exactly how to work inside the space between the written rules. Independent defense analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted in their April 2026 report that the fragile ceasefire in the Middle East war was hiding a far more dangerous reality in which Iran still controlled who passed through the strait and at what price. The simple truth is this: in April 2026, the Strait of Hormuz isn't controlled by the US Navy alone. It isn't controlled by the Iranian Navy alone either. It's controlled by whoever can move through the legal, technical, and political space the fastest. On April 14th, that was one Chinese ship called Starry. You finally understand why this war isn't really about missiles and airstrikes at all. It's really about who controls the next 30 years of global oil shipping and who sets the real rules of the sea. On April 14th, a sanctioned Chinese-owned tanker called Starry became the first ship to break a U.S. Navy blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. It didn't fire a single shot. It didn't fight any battle. It simply used the exact gaps the American blockade had created in its own written rules. As of this reporting, the ship's been tracked near Keshem Island inside Iranian territorial waters. The war still remains in a very fragile ceasefire that could break at any moment. If this report gave you the real facts, then please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon. Thank you for watching until the very end.